Welcome back. Before we get started, 5 Questions has one important rule. There's no maybes. We answer these questions yes or no. That's the game. But I don't want to waste any more of your time. We have plenty to get through, so let's dive in. To answer our first question, we must dive into the Broncos offense as a whole, which is of course led by head coach Sean Payton, who took influence from the likes of Mike Shanahan, Bill Parcells and John Gruden in creating his own version of the West Coast offense. Quick throws have become a signature of the Sean Payton offense, mainly due to the fact that Drew Brees was his franchise quarterback during his successful reign as Saints head coach, but he has been doing things slightly differently with Bo Nix. The quick game is still very much a factor, but less so in the 5 to 10 yard range, and more so with the screen game. This has given the likes of Marvin Mims, Troy Franklin, and Lil Jordan Humphrey a role to play despite being underwhelming in some other aspects. On the flip side, 13% of throws being downfield is actually about 13th in the NFL. So clearly Payton has recognised the speed as an opportunity to either throw out wide or throw downfield. But every team needs an intermediate game, and luckily the Broncos have a cheat code. One of my main takeaways from watching the Broncos film is that I have been completely underappreciating Courtland Sutton. He has more than double the receiving yards that Marvin Mims has, who is second in receiving for the Broncos, and he is earning these receptions because most of them, as I've alluded to, are coming in the intermediate region of the field. It's not like he's sitting underneath zone coverage, gaining some yards after the catch. This is him being genuinely too much to handle. Having a big target who can run routes the way that Sutton can was vital for Bo Nix because he's really a way of opening up this Sean Payton offense. It pushes the defense back and gives him some space underneath, which is where Devon Vele found much of his success. He was third in receiving for the Broncos. So that's the offense in terms of passing, but getting back to the original question, can Bo Nix take a leap in year 2? Well, he's going to have some help. These are genuine improvements to the Broncos offense, starting with free agency signing Evan Ingram, tight end formerly for the Jaguars, and he's coming off a torn labrum, which I think has probably led to people underestimating how strong of a signing this is for the Broncos, because the fact that he plays tight end and not receiver is really the only difference between him and Courtland Sutton. In fact, he's actually slightly shorter than Sutton at 6'3", but those elusive movement skills are absolutely there. And the Broncos are starting to develop a strategy that I think a few teams in the league have been going for in recent years. Everyone in the media seems to talk about balance when it comes to a receiver group. They think you want a slot receiver, a big receiver, and a fast receiver. Whereas the way I look at it, I think you want an overload of one. I think you want 3 fast receivers or 3 big receivers or 3 nifty route runners, because then you're going to create a mismatch where the defense just doesn't have 3 6'4" defensive backs or 3 defensive backs that run a 4-3 40-yard dash. As we've spoken about, the Broncos have some quick receivers, but the way I see it going next season, it's going to be Courtland Sutton, Evan Ingram, and Devon Vele, who is 6'5". I don't know if there's a defense in the NFL who has enough big defensive backs to truly cover those 3 guys. And then you add on top of this Pat Bryant, who they drafted in the 3rd round, and I was a big fan of Bryant during the draft process. He's 6'3", so he continues this mismatch element that we were speaking about. I thought he was an elusive route runner, but one of the most noticeable things about him in college was his ability to make the first defender miss. So he could be another receiver for the Broncos who does a lot of damage in the screen game. Now, that was a lot of positives to come away with such a negative answer. So to explain myself, I'm going to take you back to my very first video on YouTube. you wouldn't have heard what I was saying because it was produced worse than a modern-day Kanye West album, but I was ranking the 2024 quarterback draft class, and by the time the draft came around, I'd actually moved Penix and Nix ahead of Drake May, and I still have my questions about May, but he's already shown more than I was expecting him to. That's a conversation for another day, but the point being is that I didn't have Nix, May or Penix as a first rounder. Bo Nix to me was a second round quarterback, and my point at the time was never that he's going to be a bad quarterback. In fact, I even said that I think he could be a top 15 quarterback. I also spoke specifically about Sean Payton and the Broncos and about how that would be a good fit. However, I essentially thought what you were doing by drafting Bo Nix in the first round was leaving yourself in the danger zone of averageness. And it wasn't even a talent thing. I just thought he was too conservative. Or at least it was with Oregon, but then I looked at his years at Auburn and he was making lots of mistakes. So I did wonder if this was a case of being conservative because he didn't trust himself to be aggressive while still making good decisions. He had a great rookie season. I don't want to take that away from him, but he threw a lot of screens, and even when he was throwing deep, the deep region is more about the arm strength and the ball placement, as opposed to in the intermediate range where you can start making mistakes like these. It's a much better judgment for a quarterback's natural feel for decision making. We spoke about Courtland Sutton being great in the intermediate region, but he was basically the Broncos' whole intermediate game. They threw into the intermediate regions very rarely, and yet Bo Nix had 7 interceptions in that region. And that to me is the answer in terms of whether Bo Nix can take a leap in year 2. I'm not saying he's going to be worse, but I do think this is about as good as it gets with Bo Nix. I don't think he has it in him to expand upon what he's doing in this offense right now. On paper, the Broncos went under the radar as one of the best defenses in the league last season, holding their opponents to 4.9 yards per play and causing 25 turnovers. But in the second half of the season, they gave up 32 points to the Browns, 34 points to the Chargers, 30 points to the Bengals, and 31 points to the Bills, leading many to question whether this defense has been exposed. So what's the deal with this Vance Joseph defense? The Broncos had the 7th highest blitz rate last season, resulting in more pressures than any team in the NFL. Joseph often likes to go with the 5 defensive linemen as opposed to the base 4, and generally speaking, the linebackers are always close to the line of scrimmage. And if he's feeling really aggressive, he's not afraid to bring the nickel into the pressure as well. Blitzing as often as the Broncos do doesn't just have an effect on the passing game though. They held offenses to an average of 3.9 yards per carry, which was second in the NFL, and it's not rocket science, they just had more players clogging up the box. So why did teams start to get the better of this defense as the year went on? Well, let's start with the run defense because whilst it was generally very good, there are flaws that showed up in some of these games. And their main problem versus the run is that these linebackers attack the run, as we spoke about, but if they find themselves in the wrong position, it leads to big holes because Denver prioritizes getting pressure on the quarterback. So instead of having defensive tackles who fill the space, hold their ground and stuff the run, they're looking to get around the offensive lineman. So if they don't catch them in the backfield, then it's trouble. In my opinion though, the main thing that needs addressing is the passing game. And here's the dilemma. Quite simply, if you're committing your linebackers and maybe even your nickel as well to stacking the box, then that leads to defensive backs on their own. So for this scheme to work, you need multiple defensive backs who can cover man-to-man and do so at a high level. The way Vance Joseph likes to do it is he likes to put his DBs in off-man coverage as opposed to press-man coverage. And this is where Pat Surtain is great because he's very instinctual in terms of recognizing when it's time to close that distance. I don't know whether I agree with Surtain winning Defensive Player of the Year, but obviously Surtain isn't the issue. He's an excellent corner. The issue is the guys around him. Jaquan McMillan has been playing nickel for the Broncos, and Riley Moss has been the other outside corner. They just don't have the movement skills to stick to these receivers consistently. And that's it really. That's where this defense wasn't so strong in the second half of the season, but it was still a great defensive season overall. And has this defense been exposed? No, they just need a more talented secondary and they're on their way. First of all, they've got a guy by the name of Chris Abrams-Drain. He was drafted in the 5th round last year, but didn't get any playing time until week 13, probably because he came into the league undersized. He does lack length and he was also lacking some mass, but I was a huge fan of this guy coming out of the draft, and he did display some really sticky coverage when he got his opportunities. He's a very fluid mover, and I genuinely think he could be a starter for the Broncos next season. And now you draft Jahdae Barron with your 1st round pick and you're cooking with gas, because this guy is perfect for the Broncos. I personally feel like he could play on the outside, but he might play nickel because he does lack length. But regardless, he fits this scheme really well. An explosive off-man coverage corner, and he's just excellent when it comes to anticipating when it's time to close that distance, just like Pat Surtain. He also has excellent ball skills, and with his explosiveness, if he does play nickel, he's going to be great for those nickel blitzes we spoke about. So did the Broncos have a successful offseason? Well, to answer that, there's still a couple of moves that we need to address. As you can see, a lot more players coming in than going out. They are losing their most important linebacker last year, Cody Barton, but that's okay because they are getting Alex Singleton back from injury. He tore his ACL in week 3 last season, and as long as he is coming back healthy, he's a great starting linebacker. And you could honestly argue the Broncos have improved their linebacker room because they're pairing Singleton up with free agency signing Dre Greenlaw. The problem is, Greenlaw also barely played last season, also due to injury, and even more concerningly, he's reported to have torn his quadriceps just a few weeks ago and could be missing a decent amount of this season. This said, the Broncos do still have an element of depth at linebacker, so it's probably not the end of the world, and if they can get Greenlaw back healthy, he's going to be excellent for what the Broncos will ask him to do. And he's going to have some familiarity because the Broncos have also signed Talanoa Hufanga, safety formerly for the 49ers, who, believe it or not, has been struggling with injuries. He was coming off a torn ACL in 2023 and then ended last season in week 11 after tearing several ligaments in his wrist. Again though, not the end of the world. The Broncos still have some depth at safety. These guys they're bringing in are basically just adding to the upside. They also added to the defensive line in the 3rd and 4th round. I never actually watched Savion Jones during the draft process, but at 280 pounds, I've got a feeling he's actually going to play on the interior. And I was a big fan of Q Robinson, someone who went under the radar due to a lack of sample size with Alabama, but I thought he had a ton of upside as an outside linebacker in a 3-4 system which the Broncos like to utilize. And there's just one more thing we need to discuss before we can start diving into what this all really means for the Broncos. So the Broncos drafted running back RJ Harvey with their 2nd round pick, and I was not a huge fan of this guy coming out because I thought he was quite scheme specific, but he makes absolute perfect sense to me with the Broncos. We didn't really speak about the run game on offense, but we did speak about attacking the wide regions, and that's what the run game is all about for the Broncos. Unfortunately, Peyton inherited Javonte Williams, and I actually think Williams could be a decent back. I'm not knocking him, but he's not got the speed that you want in a scheme like this, and that's where RJ Harvey is perfect. Very explosive. He had a ton of breakaway runs in college, and I really think he could transform this Broncos running game. So to answer the question, yes, the Broncos had a successful offseason. There was no major splash, but everything they've done in the offseason made sense to me. Lots of smart moves that fit what they're trying to do scheme-wise. But now we get to the 2 major questions that really this whole video has been leading up to. Well, this was a much easier question than I was expecting it to be, because actually when you look at their schedule, it's not the toughest. I gave them 10 wins, which they got into the playoffs with last season, and that was being pretty harsh. I had them losing games against the Texans and the Packers, which I think they could win. But you look at the Titans, the Colts, the Jets, the Cowboys don't look in great shape. I'm bullish about the Raiders, but they still have some holes. You look at the Jaguars. We obviously don't know enough about what teams are going to look like yet, But on paper, there's a lot of games here which the Broncos should be able to win and build their foundation towards making the playoffs again. So yes, I think they will make the playoffs. The more difficult and more important question though is this one. Is there a realistic possibility of Sean Payton and Bo Nix ever winning a Super Bowl with the Broncos? Because sometimes I think we lose track of the fact that that is what it's all about. It's all well and good being competitive, but only if it steps towards competing for a Super Bowl. And generally speaking, there's two ways of doing it. You have an elite roster or you have an elite quarterback. And my fear for the Broncos is that finding the elite quarterback is actually much easier, but they actually haven't been bad enough to end up with a high pick and get themselves a Caleb Williams, a Jaden Daniels, a CJ Stroud. And of course you have to pick the right one, but it's just one good decision and now you're a competitor year on year. But unfortunately, the situation the Broncos have found themselves in, they need to now do it the way that the Lions have done it, or the 49ers, or the Eagles being the best example. The Eagles built the best offensive line in football with a 7th rounder, a couple of 2nd rounders, and a cheap free agency signing. They got a top 3 wide receiver for the 18th overall pick and a 3rd round pick. They've been excellent in free agency, but they've also smashed their 1st rounders. They traded up to get Devontae Smith. They traded up to get Jalen Carter. And here's the bad decision that has made it even more difficult for the Broncos. They traded for Russell Wilson, and I'd honestly forgotten how much they gave up. 2 1st round picks, 2 2nd round picks, a 5th round pick, and some extras. And when they let go of Russell Wilson, it cost them $85 million in dead cap. So where I look at this team and basically just feel like there's a lack of genuine superstar talent, that's what those 1st round picks could have been. Not to mention the 2nd rounders and the free agency money as well. And honestly, what's amazing is they haven't even drafted that well anyway. So they've done a great job keeping this team competitive, but there's not enough of a young foundation here for me to see where this team is going to grow. So I didn't come into this video expecting to be negative, but the overall sentiment I've come away with is that this team is maxed out. I think they're going to be competitive this year, probably be competitive the year after that. But as they're competitive, they're not going to have the early 1st round picks to build that young foundation of talent. And at some point in the next few years, I think it's going to start to feel like they're sinking more so than they're growing. But that's all from me. If you did enjoy the content, please consider liking and subscribing, as it greatly supports the channel. And if there's a specific team you want me to do, then let me know in the comments and I'll make sure it's one of the next teams on my radar. Thanks so much for watching and I'll see you next time.